The Tri-Spiral Naval Institute hung in space like a monument to bureaucratic overreach, its gleaming spires and rotating habitat rings spinning lazily around a binary star system, whose twin suns seemed locked in an eternal dance of mutual annoyance. Here, in this marvel of engineering and testament to galactic cooperation, the finest military minds from across 47 star systems gathered to learn the noble arts of warfare, diplomacy, and maintaining rigid social hierarchies that would have made medieval feudalism look progressive by comparison. The Institute operated on what its administrators fondly called the natural order principle, which was a polite way of saying that some species were born to command while others were born to follow orders and occasionally serve as cannon fodder. At the apex of this cosmic food chain sat the hegemony species, 7-foot-tall crystalline beings whose natural telepathic abilities and tendency toward philosophical pontificating had convinced them they were the galaxy's designated adults. Below them, arranged in descending order of perceived evolutionary sophistication, were the various client species who had earned their places through combinations of technological advancement, political maneuvering, and the kind of selective breeding programs that made eugenicists look like amateur hobbyists. And then, occupying a position somewhere between interesting curiosities and walking disaster magnets, were the carbon-based life forms from the galactic rim. Species like the humans, those plucky bipeds from Sol 3 who had somehow managed to stumble into faster-than-light travel using what appeared to be equal parts mathematics, desperation, and what their own scientists had described in official reports as cosmic-level stubbornness. Cadet Raven Torres stood in the Institute's Central Assembly, her dark hair regulation short and her uniform impeccably maintained, while around her towered beings that evolution had apparently designed using entirely different instruction manuals. The hegemony cadets gleamed like living prisms, their crystalline forms catching and refracting light in patterns that made geometry professors weep with joy. The synthetic cadets, those artificial beings who had achieved consciousness through sheer computational will, hummed quietly as they processed 17 different conversations simultaneously while calculating optimal cafeteria seating arrangements. The aquatic delegation floated in their environmental suits, their translucent forms undulating with the kind of grace that made water seem like a solid by comparison. Each species had its place, its role, its carefully defined position in the grand hierarchy of galactic civilization. Except for the humans, who seemed to exist in a category all their own, one that the Institute's classification system had labeled Adaptive Carbon-Based Primitives Educational Outreach Program, which was a remarkably polite way of saying charity cases with anger management issues. Today, announced Captain Druix Calaith, his synthetic voice carrying the kind of measured authority that made smart people pay attention and smarter people remember urgent appointments elsewhere, we begin the quarterly aptitude evaluation, that cherished tradition where we assess each cadet's progress according to their species' natural capabilities and limitations. Raven noticed how his optical senses lingered on the human cadets when he mentioned limitations, the way a museum curator might regard particularly fragile exhibits. Beside her, Cadet NYX Harvel's breathing remained steady, though her hands had developed the kind of stillness that preceded either meditation or violence. Cadet Kai Brennan's expression suggested he was mentally reviewing vocabulary from several languages, most of which probably weren't appropriate for mixed company. The evaluation protocols had been refined over centuries of academic excellence, each assessment carefully calibrated to showcase the natural superiority of more evolved species while providing appropriate challenges for lesser beings. The hegemony cadets would face complex strategic scenarios that tested their telepathic coordination and philosophical reasoning. The synthetics would tackle computational problems that would reduce organic brains to smoking wreckage. The aquatics would navigate three-dimensional tactical situations that made regular warfare look like a children's game. And the humans would face what the system had designated as species-appropriate physical challenges, which was Academy speak for obstacle courses that won't completely kill them, but will demonstrate their obvious inferiority to everyone watching. Admiral Keth Varizon materialized at the front of the assembly with a kind of dramatic timing that suggested he'd been practicing in mirrors, his crystalline form pulsing with the satisfied energy of someone who'd never met a hierarchy he didn't want to climb. His telepathic presence filled the room like expensive cologne, overwhelming, impossible to ignore, and leaving most beings with the distinct impression that they should be somewhere else. Cadets, His voice resonated through both audible and telepathic channels, creating the kind of harmonic effect that made lesser beings feel like they were being lectured by the universe itself. The evaluation protocols have been updated this cycle to better reflect the realities of modern galactic warfare. We must ensure that each species understands not only their strengths, but their limitations. His attention turned toward the human contingent with the kind of focused interest that predators usually reserved for injured prey. Our carbon-based colleagues will be pleased to know that their assessments have been specially adapted to account for their unique evolutionary circumstances. We wouldn't want to set unrealistic expectations that might lead to disappointment or, worse, casualties in actual service. The assembled alien cadets rippled with what might have been laughter if it had been funnier and less cruel. Raven felt her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, a response so subtle it might have been mistaken for a muscle twitch if anyone had been paying attention to details like human facial expressions, which they weren't. The evaluation complex sprawled across 3 levels of the Institute's training section, each environment precisely designed to test specific aspects of military capability. The humans found themselves assigned to Level C, which the facility's cheerful automated systems described as basic physical competency assessment with environmental hazard simulation. What it actually was, Raven realized as she surveyed the course layout, was an elaborate demonstration of human inadequacy disguised as training. The obstacles had been carefully selected to highlight every supposed weakness of carbon-based physiology, extended endurance challenges that assumed human cardiovascular systems were primitive, strength tests calibrated for species with significantly different muscle density, and reaction time scenarios that presumed human nervous systems operated at suboptimal speeds. The course record board displayed achievement scores that painted a clear picture of the natural hierarchy. Hegemony cadets dominated the strategic thinking assessments. Synthetics had achieved perfect scores on every computational challenge. Even the aquatics, operating in environmental suits that should have handicapped them, had outperformed human cadets by margins that made the disparity look less like competition and more like a nature documentary about natural selection in action. Pathetic showing, as usual, commented Cadet Vex Corazon, a hegemony whose telepathic abilities apparently didn't extend to reading the room or recognizing when he was being an ass in public. One is to wonder why Command continues this charade of integration when the results are so predictable. His crystalline features arranged themselves into an expression of philosophical contempt that would have impressed professors of advanced smugness. Around him, other alien cadets nodded with the kind of agreement that suggested they'd had this conversation before and found it endlessly fascinating. Raven stepped up to the starting line of her assigned course, her movements carrying the kind of controlled precision that marked someone who'd been practicing violence since before they could spell restraint. The course sensors activated, bathing her in scanning beams that would monitor everything from heart rate to cellular oxygen consumption, creating a comprehensive record of human limitation for future academic reference. The first obstacle was a climbing wall that reached 30 feet into the training complex's ceiling, its surface designed to test grip strength and endurance against artificial gravity that had been calibrated for beings with significantly different muscle-to-mass ratios than baseline humans. The second challenge involved navigating a maze while carrying a pack that the system had loaded with what it considered appropriate weight for a species of Raven's estimated physical capability. She completed the wall climb in 43 seconds, her movements efficient and controlled in ways that would have impressed climbing instructors if any of them had been paying attention to technique rather than elapsed time. The maze took her 2 minutes and 17 seconds, including 15 seconds spent deliberately taking a wrong turn to avoid finishing fast enough to raise questions about the weight distribution in her pack. The endurance run that followed was 3 miles of varied terrain designed to push human cardiovascular systems to their presumed limits, complete with environmental hazards that tested reflexes, balance, and what the course designers had termed primitive survival instincts. Raven finished in 19 minutes and 43 seconds, breathing hard enough to satisfy the monitoring systems, while internally calculating how much faster she could have completed it if she'd been trying to impress anyone. Her final scores appeared on the evaluation display with the kind of ceremonial importance usually reserved for announcing lottery numbers or casualty reports. Marginal performance meets minimum species standards. Recommend continued remedial training. The results board told a story that had become depressingly familiar over the months since human cadets had been admitted to the Institute. Consistently inferior performance across all metrics. Predictable limitations that confirmed every assumption about primitive evolution and cognitive capability. Evidence that supported the natural order principle with a kind of scientific rigor that made bigots feel intellectually justified. Precisely what we expected. Admiral Varizon's voice cut through the post-evaluation atmosphere like a blade through tissue paper, his telepathic presence radiating the satisfied energy of someone whose prejudices had just been validated by official documentation. Carbon-based limitations manifest consistently across all assessment categories. He moved through the assembled cadets with a kind of casual authority that suggested he'd never encountered serious resistance in his life, his crystalline form catching the light in ways that made him look like a living trophy for advanced evolution. Behind him trailed a collection of senior cadets and junior officers, their expressions carrying the mix of professional interest and casual superiority that marked beings who had never questioned their place in the cosmic hierarchy. The endurance scores are particularly illuminating, Varizon continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the assembly area through a combination of enhanced acoustics and telepathic projection. 19 minutes for a 3-mile course represents approximately 73% of the baseline expectation for a properly evolved military species. The climbing assessment shows similar deficiencies in strength-to-weight optimization. Raven stood at attention with the other human cadets, her expression professionally neutral, while her mind calculated exactly how many different ways she could demonstrate the flaws in Varizon's assessment methodology. Around them, alien cadets listened with a kind of fascinated attention usually reserved for nature documentaries or traffic accidents, their superior evolutionary advantages making them natural audiences for lectures about primitive inadequacy. Of course, Varizon's tone carried the kind of condescending patience usually reserved for explaining complicated concepts to slow children. We must make allowances for the limitations of unguided evolution. These beings developed on a world that favored persistence over efficiency, endurance over intelligence, brute survival over elegant adaptation. The Admiral stepped closer to the human contingent, his towering crystalline form casting shadows that seemed to emphasize the size differential between advanced beings and their primitive cousins. His telepathic presence intensified, creating the kind of psychic pressure that made lesser species remember their place in the natural order. It's almost admirable, in a way, he continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a eulogy for a particularly brave pet. The stubborn refusal to acknowledge limitation, the touching belief that effort can overcome genetic destiny, the primitive optimism that suggests evolution might somehow be negotiable. Raven felt something shift in the atmosphere around her, a subtle tension that preceded either thunderstorms or catastrophic structural failures. Beside her, NYX's breathing had developed a kind of rhythm that preceded either yoga or homicide. Kai's expression suggested he was mentally reviewing technical manuals for devices that probably violated several interstellar weapons treaties. Perhaps, Varizon said, his tone carrying the kind of helpful suggestion that made smart people remember urgent appointments in other star systems, it's time for a more direct demonstration of the realities involved. Sometimes primitive species require concrete examples to understand abstract concepts like limitation and natural hierarchy. His hand moved with the kind of casual arrogance that suggested he'd never encountered consequences for his actions, crystalline fingers reaching toward Raven's collar with the clear intention of using her as a visual aid for his lecture on evolutionary inadequacy. The sound that followed was sharp, clean, and final in the way that breaking glass or political careers tends to be. Varizon's elegant crystalline arm developed a bend that defied both anatomy and the known properties of his species' biological structure, the crack echoing through the assembly area like a gunshot in a library. The Admiral's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and agony in roughly the same time it takes for light to travel from a star to its nearest planet, which was still several seconds longer than it had taken Raven to assess the threat, calculate her response, and execute a defensive action that would have made hand-to-hand combat instructors across the galaxy weep with professional pride. Varizon hit the deck with a kind of undignified impact usually reserved for large objects falling from significant heights, his crystalline features contorted into an expression of shock that suggested he'd just discovered that the universe had a sense of irony and it was largely directed at his expense. The assembly area filled with silence so complete it seemed to have mass, 300 alien cadets staring at the scene with expressions that ranged from horror to fascination to the kind of dawning realization that suggested several fundamental worldviews were undergoing emergency reconstruction. Raven stood over the Admiral's writhing form, her posture perfect, her expression calm, and her voice carrying the kind of polite inquiry that made the question echo through the Institute's corridors like a challenge thrown at the feet of galactic civilization itself. Who's next? The response was immediate and universal. Alien cadets began creating distance with the kind of careful precision usually reserved for handling unstable explosives or unreasonable tax inspectors, their advanced evolutionary advantages suddenly seeming less relevant when faced with a species that apparently viewed breaking superior officers as a reasonable response to unwanted physical contact. Cadet Vex Corazon found himself stammering the first coherent words anyone had managed since Varizon's impromptu anatomy lesson. "You can't. There are protocols, regulations, consequences for assaulting superior officers." Raven's attention shifted to him with a kind of casual focus that made small mammals remember urgent survival priorities. "I defended myself against unwanted physical contact from a superior officer who was using his position to intimidate cadets based on their species of origin. Institute regulations are quite specific about both assault and discrimination, though I suspect most of you haven't bothered reading the sections that apply to protecting primitive species." Around the assembly area, other human cadets were beginning to straighten, their postures shifting in ways that suggested they'd been operating under constraints that were no longer relevant. NYX cracked her knuckles with a kind of sound that made knuckles seem like a questionable evolutionary development. Kai smiled with an expression that made predatory fish look friendly by comparison. "The interesting thing," Raven continued, her tone carrying the kind of conversational quality usually reserved for discussing weather patterns or lunch preferences, "is that humans have been operating under what you might call diplomatic restrictions since joining the galactic community. We've been very careful to present ourselves as manageable, predictable, safely primitive." Varizon managed to prop himself up on his unbroken appendage, his face a masterpiece of pain and indignation that would have been touching if he hadn't spent the last hour systematically humiliating cadets for their genetic heritage. This is assault. You're all finished. I'll see every primitive expelled from this institute." Primitives. Raven's tone carried the kind of mild curiosity that preceded either scientific breakthroughs or international incidents. "That's fascinating. Tell me, Admiral, what's the surface gravity on your homeworld?" The question hit the conversation like a meteor striking a dinner party, completely derailing the expected flow of events, and leaving everyone struggling to process the apparent non sequitur. Varizon blinked in confusion, his pain-addled brain trying to understand why planetary specifications had suddenly become relevant to his humiliation. What does that have to do with anything? Hegemony Prime maintains a surface gravity of approximately 0.8 standard galactic units, Raven explained, her voice taking on the kind of educational tone usually reserved for particularly slow students. The synthetic homeworld runs about 0.6, when they bother with planetary surfaces at all. Most aquatic worlds manage 0.7 on average. She paused, letting the numbers sink in while alien minds began performing calculations they probably wished they'd never learned to do. Earth maintains a surface gravity of 1.4 standard galactic units, which means that every human in this institute has been operating under what amounts to a permanent training handicap for their entire lives. Every movement we make, every physical action we perform, every reflexive response we demonstrate has been practiced under conditions that would hospitalize most of you within hours. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for religious experiences or the moments before particularly spectacular explosions. Alien cadets stared at their human counterparts with expressions suggesting that several core assumptions about the universe were undergoing rapid and uncomfortable revision. But the evaluations. Vex Corazon's voice trailed off as the implications struck him like a freight transport carrying a cargo of inconvenient truths. Were carefully designed to exploit human limitations while maximizing alien advantages, Raven finished. Which raises interesting questions about how someone managed to identify those limitations so precisely without ever seeing humans operating at full capability. Admiral Varizon's crystalline features cycled through several shades of dawning horror as he realized that his carefully orchestrated demonstration of human inadequacy had just been turned inside out like a particularly embarrassing garment. "The assessment protocols," he whispered, his voice carrying the kind of dread usually reserved for audit notifications or family reunions. "Command said they were based on comprehensive species analysis." "Analysis that Earth provided," Kai added helpfully, his tone carrying the kind of cheerful malice that made sadists look like motivational speakers. "Turns out we've been very interested in studying alien military capabilities, tactical doctrines, and psychological profiles. What better way to gather intelligence than to let you think you were studying us?" The assembly area erupted into chaos that would have impressed natural disaster coordinators and political campaign managers. Alien cadets who had spent months confidently asserting their evolutionary superiority over primitive Deathworlders suddenly found themselves reconsidering fundamental assumptions about natural selection, combat effectiveness, and the wisdom of antagonizing species that had evolved on planets actively trying to exterminate them. Institute security arrived with timing that suggested either excellent crisis management or terrible luck, their weapons drawn and expressions carrying the kind of professional confusion that preceded either enlightenment or very interesting paperwork. The scene that greeted them, Admiral Varizon on the deck with a broken appendage, surrounded by alien cadets backing away from humans who looked remarkably composed for beings who had just redefined the Institute's power structure, defied easy classification in their incident report templates. "Stand down," commanded Security Chief Meridian, his aquatic form undulating with authority inside his environmental suit. "Explain the situation immediately." Raven stepped forward with the kind of calm precision that made military instructors proud and administrators nervous. "Admiral Varizon attempted to physically intimidate me during what appeared to be an educational demonstration. I responded with appropriate defensive measures. His injuries are consistent with resistance to unlawful physical contact by a superior officer." Around the assembly area, alien witnesses began offering their own accounts of the incident, their testimonies painting a picture of systematic discrimination, manipulated assessments, and what was beginning to look like an intelligence operation that had just suffered catastrophic operational failure. Within 4 hours, the incident had escalated through the Institute's command structure with efficiency that would have impressed epidemic disease specialists. Within 8 hours, Earth's diplomatic representatives were conducting emergency consultations with Galactic Command, their expressions carrying the kind of patient satisfaction that suggested they'd been anticipating exactly this development. Within 12 hours, the Institute's evaluation protocols were undergoing complete restructuring. Admiral Varizon was facing charges that ranged from discrimination to assault to what military prosecutors were diplomatically terming conduct prejudicial to interspecies relations. And every human cadet had been reassigned to advanced tactical programs with accommodations that actually reflected their capabilities rather than their assumed limitations. Raven found herself promoted to training coordinator and tasked with developing new assessment protocols that would properly evaluate Deathworld species. The position allowed her to observe with considerable satisfaction as beings who had spent months mocking human inadequacy struggled to complete basic exercises under Earth standard gravity simulation. Admiral Varizon, his appendage reconstructed with synthetic components, and his career reconstructed with considerably less success, found himself reassigned to administrative duties under human supervision. The irony was so thick it could have been used to armor capital ships, and probably should have been, given the beating his professional reputation was taking on a daily basis. The fundamental error, Raven explained to her new class of alien cadets as they attempted exercises that human children would have considered recreational activities, lies in confusing technological advancement with evolutionary fitness. She paused to assist a synthetic cadet who had overheated during what amounted to a light calisthenics routine, her movements carrying the kind of casual strength that no longer surprised anyone who'd been paying attention. Advanced civilizations tend to develop in environments that are stable, predictable, and forgiving of mistakes. Technological solutions replace biological adaptation. Comfort becomes a primary selection pressure. Her gaze swept across the assembled beings, most of whom were discovering that evolution on Easy-mode worlds produced Easy-mode beings. Death worlds don't offer that luxury. They produce species that have survived everything their environment could devise to kill them, using nothing but biological adaptation, intelligence, and absolute refusal to die quietly. We don't represent evolutionary failure. We represent evolutionary success under the hardest possible conditions. Admiral Varizon, gasping on the training deck after attempting an obstacle course that human adolescents use for entertainment, managed to look up with an expression carrying the kind of hard-earned wisdom usually reserved for reformed tax evaders or successful politicians. "How long have you been planning this?" Raven's smile carried warmth that would have been touching if it hadn't been so clearly predatory. "Since we realized the galaxy was populated by species who had mistaken comfort for strength, technology for capability, and assumptions for facts. It seemed educational to let you maintain those misconceptions until circumstances required correction." She helped him to his feet with gentle care that somehow managed to emphasize exactly how much physical capability she was restraining. "The truth is, Admiral, humans aren't the galaxy's most successful accident. We're the galaxy's most successful survivors, and we've been very, very patient while you figured out what that actually means." As Varizon steadied himself against the training equipment, he noticed something that should have been obvious from the beginning, but had somehow escaped attention during months of casual superiority. Every human cadet, instructor, and staff member moved with identical controlled precision, the same casual environmental awareness, the same barely contained potential for devastating violence that marked apex predators throughout the known galaxy. They hadn't been hiding their nature out of shame or inadequacy. They'd been hiding it out of diplomacy, the way civilized beings avoid mentioning their hosts' cooking disasters or questionable fashion choices during social gatherings. The revelation that humanity had conducted the galaxy's most comprehensive intelligence operation while being systematically underestimated and discriminated against became the kind of cosmic irony that philosophers would spend centuries trying to understand. The fact that they'd accomplished this while actually developing respect and affection for alien cultures was the kind of achievement that made other species wonder if they'd been approaching the whole civilization concept correctly. In the Institute's revised historical records, the incident would be documented as the Tri-Spiral Recalibration, a diplomatically neutral term that managed to avoid mentioning broken appendages, shattered worldviews, or the fact that an entire military establishment had just discovered they'd been conducting strategic analysis on deliberately misleading data, while the subjects of their study had been analyzing them with considerably more accuracy. And throughout the Institute's corridors, alien cadets learned to approach their human colleagues with a kind of respectful caution usually reserved for handling volatile compounds or unexploded ordnance, which was probably the most accurate analogy anyone had managed to develop. After all, as Raven had so politely demonstrated, there's a universe of difference between choosing not to break someone's arm and lacking the capability to do so. The galaxy, it turned out, had been operating under a dangerous misunderstanding about which category humans actually occupied. Some lessons, apparently, required more direct teaching methods than others.